I met Alex back in the day when we were late teens. We met each other when I was visiting my bestie at her sorority house at UC Berkeley. They are soror sisters. Shout out to Gamma Phi Beta. We just immediately connected because we were both going into education. And I believe she even was an English teacher. So we definitely connected from there. So after we graduated, we still kept in contact, would go out and talk about our experiences as English teachers, and we would share stories. And it was just nice to connect with someone when we're amongst our friends who are non-educators. So we had that connection. And then life happened. We're adults. So we lost contact for a little bit, for a minute. And I want to say 10 plus years, but we reconnected via LinkedIn. So I am excited to introduce Alexandria Christina Creer Kahn. Alex started her career in education, working to support elementary school teachers and leaders engaged in the school improvement process. Over the course of her career focusing on educational equity, Alex has worked in several roles in K 12 and higher ed, including teacher, school coach, principal, and district leader, as well as a graduate instructor. Alex is currently the Senior Director of Academic Programs at Alder Graduate School of Education. And y'all, she is a co author to the book Identity Safe Classrooms, grades 6 through 12 Pathways to Belonging. Welcome, Alex.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. So good to
Yes,
be here.
we are
Uh,
excited to hear from you for sure.
so, Alex, before you tell us what your current school leadership is now and what you are up to now, please share us your educational journey. And you could go as far back as you want from like preschool or just cut straight to high school or college. Basically, we just want to get an understanding of what impacted you and affected you to become the school leader you are today.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. Uh, the truth is like I was not one of those people who sometimes you hear folks who do play teaching when they're small children. I was definitely someone who initially thought they were going to be a doctor, partly because I just think I was first in my family to go to college, and so there weren't a lot like, what do you do? What are the career options available to you? But being with kids has always been something that was of interest, and then um and yeah, supporting kids has always been something I've been interested in. And I think um my high school experience was one of the most influential in my life that kind of really inspired me to go into education, and largely because I was a kid who was able to navigate school. I was able to, both because I had a personality that was in retrospect was largely perceived as being compliant. I was a curious kid, I was a reader, and I think that teachers gravitated toward that personality. And so I also could take tests well. And so I ended up being in the sort of quote unquote high track in a very tracked high school. And I remember reflecting on that in like while it was happening and seeing sort of the racial differences of students who I'd gone to middle school with and how they weren't in my classes, how my classes became more and more white as I moved from freshman year all the way through junior and senior year. And I think graduating from that process and also having a best friend in my high school years who did not she didn't have the same access. So there are times when she'd apply for um getting into honors classes and she wasn't able to, and having to, like, supporting her and appealing for those kinds of things, or having to kind of um when I was scheduled in classes in the wrong way, need to advocate, and not having necessarily a parent who knew how to navigate those spaces. I went to Cal thinking I was going to be a biology. I was intended biology, but my passion was still in this sort of injustice that I'd seen and was able to navigate, but saw a lot of my peers who weren't. And so, mid college, sort of existential crisis, I was like, I don't think I'm going to go into science. I really feel really passionate about becoming an educator, and I decided to major in English, which I'd, so went from biology to English. in pre-med. And then, yeah, I decided I started taking classes in the Department of Education, and then I realized like this is what I want to do. And I went back to my high school and was doing some work. And then I graduated in a way, honestly, in a really unique situation where the organization I joined was supporting schools and school around school improvement, which was like a big push at the time with like No Child Left Behind. And so I was, a graduate from, an undergrad, and then helping teachers, which I had like no training initially. And that's, I'm sure they were like, what is your job? How, like, what experience do you bring to this situation? But I was trained to kind of help do kind of a results oriented cycle of inquiry. And so that really helped me learn um a lot about schools, how schools were structured, what change efforts were impactful, what didn't work, how times where teachers were affirmed and times where they were not affirmed. And it really promoted my own desire to transition and go. I went back to grad school, became an English teacher, went through step at Stanford, and then, yeah, transition, found a job. I wasn't really discerning. I was like, What's out there?" Again, like I wasn't fully aware, and stayed at Leadership Public Schools for 11 years, and started as a teacher and became a principal at that same school, and then left as a CAO. And there was really, being a principal and a teacher in the same school is one of the greatest gifts, I think, to be able to really understand what uh school your fellow colleagues need, what students need. And it was actually at the school campus that my father's family went to. So my cousins went to Castlemont campus, um and so that was also, it felt very connected to me on a community level. And now I'm in higher ed, which I hadn't planned, but it has its own really unique orientations towards supporting teachers and preparing them for education. So yeah, it's a long-winded educational journey, but um that's how I've ended up in this role.
I love that. I love that you also didn't like start off right away knowing you wanted to go into education, but picking from your own experience and seeing what was in front of you, the injustices, and saying like, I'm gonna be a doctor, but like this is still kind of in me, and I'm still thinking about that experience and how it's impacted me. I'm sure there are things that come up too, like in undergrad and navigating that space, to then say like, yeah, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna be an educator. And even start off like in a position of like, wait, do I even know what I'm doing? But I know I want to do this, and going back and getting that credential, and leading schools at the same school you were a teacher at. I mean, that, and I want to go back to that actually, what you said. You said like being a principal and a teacher at the same school is such a gift. Like, tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, being a teacher, I feel like I was very close with my students. I felt it
Mm,
still remains like my most impactful experience in terms of feeling connected and feeling like my work was deeply meaningful. Everything I've done,
yeah.
I feel like is meaningful, and it's just like the connection with kids. And at the same time, like being able to, as a teacher, you are very well aware of like what's working, what's not, at least
Mm,
from your perspective, like even though your perspective as vast or limited as it might be, and how your colleagues feel. And so when I became an administrator, I took that and I was like, okay, how how does it feel to be in this space, both from the student perspective, but now also as teachers? And I think sometimes as leaders, and this is part of just perspective, your perspective is limited. And so I think
mm,
when I was able to come in as a principal, um, it helped me to navigate some of the spaces. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was hard. But it helped me bring forward, I think, a perspective and an orientation toward ensuring that perspective was always at the table,
mm.
because I knew how it felt to be a teacher in that space.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I gotta ask though. I mean, absolutely. I'm total 100%. Like, I feel you because it was the same experience for me and Aline. Like, we were students at the school, and then I became a teacher there, and then I became a site administrator at Skyline. The school where Carolyn and I, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But real talk, were there certain challenges from, you were the beloved teacher and then now you're a colleague to supervisor. Tell us about that. What are your thoughts?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a couple things uh, and what I was not aware of. First of all, I was young. So when I became sort of assistant principal, I taught for a couple years and I was like 27. Um, and so, I am moving into this role of supervision and, which is not dissimilar to my previous, when I was sharing before about, uh, right out of college supporting teachers and I was 22. And so there is this dynamic that you're aware of sort of the age or, that wheel of privilege, right? And sort of how people see you in relationship. And it's one thing if you're a colleague, it's another thing where you've transitioned into a position of power. And I think at the time I was less aware of my own positionality and power. So now a lot of times we talk about positionality and power. And so I think that yeah, when you now have power and people are like, I don't know if I should trust you. I don't know if I should believe in you. And I definitely had to navigate some experiences where that relationship shifted. I think where the people who I was already had strong relationships with, it was still strong. But I think in our field, that power differential between perceived administration and teachers is real and for real reasons. And my what I personally tried to do in those situations was just to be continually conscious of my power and to create a system of decision making that felt inclusive. Because part of what's hard, right, where I felt like when I came in and I was like, our school's really struggling. And I was like, wait a minute, these people aren't lesson planning. I was like, oh, heck no, come on, y'all. Um, that we had to have time and I had to learn strategies that didn't feel coercive. And I didn't know that they were coercive, but again, people want to feel like they have autonomy. I wanted to have autonomy as a teacher. And so I think being conscious of that. And so yes, there are definitely times where I got real and I tried to the best of my ability create those spaces of shared decision making because frequently I find in various contexts teachers' voice is not valued or uplifted in a way that honors how challenging that work can be.
I gotta ask. Okay, so I hear you with the shared decision making and being inclusive. As leaders, we're making decisions every day. So there are certain things where we have to make that decision, but then there are other parts where absolutely you need to get student voice, staff voice, just all different agencies. So could you tell us, like, when did you exercise that? Like, what was there, like a particular like event or process where you made sure that you reached out to your different agencies for their voice, opinion, and concerns?
Yeah, that's a good question. To your point, yes, I think two reactions, specifically to like a time, like going back to that lesson plan situation where, I was like, okay, we got a lesson plan. We have a shared problem that we have shared investment on how to fix because we want to work here. And the great thing was that we were a small school. So we were one of the small charter schools that shared a campus, with Castlemont. And so, again, my enthusiastic and kind of north oriented leadership style that I've since learned that that's what that is. Um, how I navigated was at first I was like, okay, let's have a day off, right? I knew teachers don't have a lot of time. So I'm like, if we just give folks time, we can do this thing. And then what I realized is that, some people were like, I don't want to do it. Like, I'm not gonna do your lesson plan. I'm not gonna submit it. And, there's different contexts to handle that differently. But in our context, I was like, well, I'm gonna send you reminders because maybe you forgot or, and what I ultimately that created that kind of dynamic of like, you want me to do something and I don't want to do either. I don't value it or I don't have time. And so what I did was I just surveyed the teachers. I said, look, backwards planning is an effective research-based practice. It does not have to be lockstep. It does have to adhere to attending to diverse learner profiles, linguistic needs, and supporting our students who have IEPs. That is the hard line. How we do that is up to us. And so let's talk about it. And so we ended up creating, I proposed, like I got that feedback and I ended up proposing PLCs, where our Wednesday professional developments, we moved from having it twice a week to once a week. So I was like, we don't need to meet twice a week to once a week. And it was, I took all that stuff that happens in meetings where it's all this update stuff and put it in sort of like a weekly meeting or a weekly, bulletin, and said, you got to read this. So if we're not going to do this in our Wednesday meetings, then read it. And then gave them time. And so fill out your lesson plan during that time, but here's a time where you can meet in your department, engage in collaboration, bring your assessments to do that backwards plan. Because the point is actually our students. It's how they're learning. It's not because I want something sent to me. And so that helped kind of get at the one, people were co-creating with each other. What does it look like to do this work collaboratively? And it also afforded me to say, these are the things that are non-negotiables. We have to be attentive to the needs of our students. We have to pay attention, and it requires time, and being able to have this time that's sort of like, already built in. We made sure that time was protected. And so I think that helped us. And then at the end of the year, what also helped us is we moved like 90 points in our API, the academic program index, and people were like, this works. And I was like, yeah, planning works. Planning does work. And that was helpful. And so it also created momentum in a way that, again, there's so many things that get thrown at teachers about what to do. And it can feel a little bit of like this, what do you call this, spray and pray or whatever. And so I just building, having a collective win after creating that shared decision making, it helps as a leader build some trust. And so then there are situations where I might not necessarily agree with you, but I either feel like I have a opportunity to connect with you and communicate my disagreement and talk about it, or we can signal at maybe we need to come back as a staff and talk about this as a collective. And again, you can't do that on every level of decision. But for big things, particularly people's time and things that affect their working conditions, I think are really important to make sure that there's collaboration around.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was important. There's a lot to take away from what you just said, and I think a lot just in general of like how we as leaders position ourselves to make decisions, and like what does that include and what does that entail, and just even what you said around like our positionality in power. I don't think we often take the time to think about what that means for moving from the classroom, or for me, I was a school counselor from the school counseling department into leadership. And so, Alex, I'm curious, like, what are you doing now? And like, how does equity and educational justice play a role in that? And we also want to talk about your book. So we'll do that too. But first, like, tell us a little bit about what you're doing and like how you're positioning equity and educational justice in that work.
Yeah. So I work now for Alder Graduate School of Ed, and we are both a higher education institution and also a teacher residency program. And so what's cool about our organization is that we partner with, or across the state, 42 different systems, and have grown rapidly in the last few years since I came on. I started in the pandemic, July of the pandemic, with a 5-month-old. And our work is really around preparing excellent justice-minded teachers, and we largely serve, and I would say at least 2/3 identify as first in their family go to college and teachers of color. And so when I think about our work, it really is about supporting like TK-12, especially having young children, like having teachers who are thoughtful, caring, community-centered, and culturally, linguistically, neurodiverse, responsive to the needs developmentally that kids have. And what's great is our dean has really set a vision around that. And then when I think about my role is largely around supporting our clinical program and helping support the bridge between coursework that's happening around what kind of classes folks are taking and the clinical experience. And so right now we have about 300 residents across the state, and I work with my team, my clinical team of there's 3 from like Maine at Alder, and then we have 20 residency directors. And so we work across various, whether it's a district or charter organization, who have wanted to partner with us in the service of really recruiting teachers from their community to work in their community schools. And so there's a really community-centered focus around that. So when I think about my work around equity and justice, it's both at how we create learning opportunities and experiences for our residents, as it is, as I've learned coming into higher ed, which I was less familiar with, on some level, is just reducing the barriers that particularly residents of color experience on their pathway to achieving a credential and being sustained in the profession in the long term.
That is dope. By any chance, do you guys partner with OUSD?
We do. We have a small partnership with OUSD for teachers who are going into teach special education.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Some of the districts we work with many partners. And so we're one of several that OUSD works with. Yeah.
Well, yeah, OUSD be working with hella organizations, but okay. I just want to know. I was like, oh my gosh, this would be dope if you worked with OUSD, and you do. But it's specifically for the SPED department.
It is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, with that said, Alex, you got to tell us about this book, though. As I said, y'all, she is the co-author to the book Identity Safe Classrooms, Pathways to Belonging and Learning. So please tell us how this book speaks on equity and how it plays a role on the quest for educational justice.
You are so kind for purchasing that book. I'm going to send both of you. There's a second one.
Where?
Inclusion and Identity Safe Schools. It's for leaders. So I'm gonna send it to both of you. So I'll get your information because I have some.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So here's the story about identity safety and how that book came about. It's a story I love telling because and shout out to Becky Cohn Vargas, who's the person who got me connected in the first place. So after being a principal, one of the questions that I had, working in Oakland and supporting new teachers specifically and coming into the context and just teachers in general, where one of the things that was essential to being effective, and I'm sure both of y'all have experienced this in your context, but being in Oakland, it's like you need for folks to really internalize what it means to support students, have a relationship, how to affirm them holistically. And I think to our earlier conversation about, I identify as a Black biracial woman, and so I grew up in the Bay Area navigating those identities. And so the notion of identity has always been really important to me, and affirming about all the different ways folks identify, and knowing that prerequisite of any teacher being successful in the context of the school that I worked at was that you had to really not just believe in kids, but see them and see all of them. And so when I transitioned from being a principal, I became a role called Director of Teacher Learning. And so part of my work was like, okay, well, what does this mean for how we support teachers? And so I was working across our network. And so I had this question specifically around classroom culture. Like, what is our stance organizationally around creating these contexts or conditions for students to really thrive? And I was like, doing some research, and I was like, Becky Cohn Vargas. I was like, oh, this is a really great article, Identity Safety, Stereotypes Are Class Still. Okay, cool. And she happened to be the aunt of one of my childhood friends I went to high school with. And so he introduced us, and then we met up for lunch, and then we created myself and one of my other colleagues, Amy Epstein, at Leadership Public Schools, a pilot project around like, how do we engage? Like, let's just start. Like, we at that point in our organization, we hadn't been as explicit about race and identity and equity in a really, forthright manner. Like, we were definitely around like backwards planning and using assessments and believing in students, and worked with 90% students of color, right? But we weren't actually talking about race. We weren't talking about the ways in which some of these issues kind of manifested in our work. And, in the early charter movement, for example, was very like college, which is important, but college centered, which kind of speaks to certain kind of value system, very high stakes, no excuses kind of culture, which that didn't align with me philosophically. So I'm like, how do we again create these conditions that can be affirming and supportive of students? And so we had this pilot project, started out with 8 teachers, and then expanded it the following year. And Becky wrote the first book, Identity Safe Classrooms, and that was for elementary age children, with Dr. Dorothy Steele. That's Dr. Claude Steele's wife. And so we were able to meet Dorothy, unfortunately, prior to her passing away. And she sort of said, this idea, what you're talking about, makes a lot of sense. And then we ended up, and Becky really leading the charge, writing a book to capture like what can identity safe classrooms mean in the context of secondary classrooms. So building on what already existed in the original book, and expanding it and including a lot of the voices from our teachers in the pilot project.
You know what? Okay, this is like the English teacher in me now, but like when I was reading through the book, I really appreciated like the structure of the book. Right? It's like I felt like each chapter was like an individual lesson plan, which eventually they could all connect, right? But then what I mean by like a lesson plan is like, okay, and like it doesn't have to chronologically go in this order, but when you walk into a classroom, you expect to hear like, there's direct instruction. You start with direct instruction, and then the guided practice, and then a connector for the students, to connecting the curriculum so that's relevant and to the students, and to the community at large. And then you have the release, and the students apply what they learn. And then towards the end, the little exit ticket, whatever you want to call it, your check for understanding, for them to reflect and assess where they're at. Well, that's how I viewed the structure of the chapters here, because each chapter, it starts off with the direct instruction. You guys name and describe a particular focus or discrepancy, just naming it, defining it, describing it. And then you have like the guided practice, like here's some protocols and practices that educators, whether it's admin or teachers, can implement. And then here's the protocols, and then here is a vignette to bring those words, I'm saying, to life. And then you have the application, which is the end of the chapter activities, like this is what y'all could start doing now. And they're all viable, there's no bells and whistles. It's very practical. And then our favorite, because Elin and I were like huge sticklers on self-reflection or self-assessment, and then each chapter ends with the educator self reflection. So it's like I just really appreciated that structure, and because it just helps, well, for any student, right? It's like you need those elements to like really like understand something, not and but we want more than just the understanding, right? We want them to not only understand it, feel it, we want them to apply it. Like what are you going to do with this information? So yeah, I appreciate the whole practicality of the book. So I'm excited for the part 2.
I'm excited that the two of you have read Identity Safe Classrooms for Secondary, because I think and I'm glad to hear that it's practical, because I do feel like that's part of where, and even as I kind of work in higher ed, where there's just a really important space for practitioners to like read the research. So like the Identity Safe Practices was a research-based framework, and then to see how it can actually live in the messiness of the classroom or the school context, and internalize it really as like a practice, like your own practice, like your own mindset, and that anything can be sort of a can be thought about through the identity safe lens. And so like one of the examples I tend to give to a lot of people about this is like greeting students at the door. And you can greet students at the door a myriad of ways, right? And you can do that in ways that promote connection and support and are affirming to identity. And there are ways in which you cannot, right? When you start asking them to take their hoods off, when you start asking students,
Or
like
mhm.
policing them as they're coming into your classroom, either A, because you don't have routines, or B, because of the relationship or the context of that school, that even at that really important first moment in a secondary space, like that one act you can do in ways that kind of promote or attract. And if you can internalize a mindset, it becomes a tool you can apply in many different ways. So I'm just glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, like what you were saying right there is like, you know, the approach, right? And it's like you need to understand why you're approaching the student that way. Like what's your mindset like? And so that just brought me to chapter 2, the educator identity, safety, and the importance of self-awareness. Like real talk, that's where all that starts. And like my last school where I was a site level admin, I was supervising the climate and culture committee, basically the PBIS committee. And before we jumped into the work and talked about the PBI, what stuff we're gonna buy for the PBIS store and all that stuff, or posters we finna update, like what I really wanted them to do, like I was just like, you know, all these protocols and processes and free erasers and stickers, like they're not going to mean anything if we don't start with ourselves. And so with the committee, like the first semester, we didn't even talk. I was like, we're not going to talk about post. Like, so they're like, let's update this, let's update that. I'm like, we're not updating any of that stuff until we figure ourselves out first. So, in conjunction with Zaretta Hammond's book, chapter 2 of your book was super helpful because, like, one way of like unpacking. Well, you guys have hella questions, but it was just like a lot of reflective questions that where is it? It is chapter 2. Yeah, just like all these questions about like, you know, helping educators unpack their like their mindset, right? So it's like where does that all start? Well, your family background, the neighborhood you grew up in, your school experience, like right now, what's happening in your life right now. And it's like all those things is what got you to where you are today. And absolutely, a lot of it could be positive things, but a lot of it could also lead to like why you have certain implicit biases, why there's you give off certain microaggressions. So it's like all those things affect your approach on student discipline, grading practices, checks for understanding, feedback, how you analyze formative assessments, how you greet students at the door, how you roll out those PBIS posters, right? So it's like all those things, it's like we got to take a step back and just be like, wait, hold up. Like, before we jump into this, like, because we're not just going to tell people, like, yeah, we're an equity school because we do PBIS up in here. It's like, no, like, that's not like it that's not it. Like we gotta like really take time to reflect on ourselves before we try to like put something else on our students in our community. So yeah, this book's it. Like I really, really, really appreciate this book, and it's practical. And us school leaders, we're busy, so it's like we need to be able to like read something real quick. And as I said, like this book, you don't need to read it. I mean, it says it in here too in the intro. You don't need to read it from cover to cover. Like you could just jump to like a topic that you want to address, and just that chapter could stand alone. Hence the word vignette. I think you guys, that's how you guys describe it to vignettes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm glad that that part in particular stood out to you because that was new. And that was part that came from our pilot. Because to your point, being able to bring forward our identities and to examine and unpack them is a crucial practice that all educators have to maintain for both the like how it helps inform your knowledge about spaces and helps you challenge, right? And that was one of the most important pieces that we like elevated because we started that pilot in 2016.
Christina can't find her unmute button.
My bad, my bad. But Alex, thank you so much for sharing your educational journey and speaking on your book with us. But we know that you're not just an educator 24/7. We also know that you're a mommy, and you need time for yourself too. So let us know, what do you do for self-care?
Yeah, so important for educators. I think professionally, and this has been I would say sort of maybe elevated or forced when I have these two little people, is boundaries. And I think that for a long time in my career, it was about being like all in all the time. And it's just a recipe for burnout. And there's so much that you're trying to support. And I think that what I've come to learn is it's not possible and it's burnout. And you need to have boundaries and you have to be okay with saying no and figuring out what are the right things to say no, whether that's to say no, I'm not going to work on, as a principal, it's hard, but it's like, it's like, here's the day I'm going to make the bulletin or whatever. But it's like, I am not working on Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
And now as a parent, I'm like, I'm not working on the weekend unless there's something significant. And so I think establishing boundaries for myself, particularly around when I work, has been a really important practice to maintain and has helped to, and as an act of self-care. I think, there's I've been really in the space of like routines. And so that's not the self-care spa day type self-care, but what can you do every day? And so finding regular times, whether it's before I pick up my children or at the beginning of my day, to just pause, to pause, to breathe, to like center myself about what matters today. And that to me is like, it helps clear all the clutter. Because I feel like being in a leadership role, I've been in leadership roles now since like 11 years. So since like 2011, that the clutter can just be, it's rapid fire. Right. And so just being able to center myself and to, now that I'm at this stage of my career, pause. Like there's so much stuff in the atmosphere that can feel very urgent. And frequently in my experience, I learned is that it's actually not. I mean, unless it's like a dire emergency, there are dire emergencies that exist in schools in particular, but a lot of things aren't. And so I think an act or routine of self-care is pausing. And I know right now there's a lot of stuff around like pausing and breath work. And like, that was not my flow. That was not my thing. But I've come to appreciate being able just to have intentional carved out, whether it's like 5 minutes time to a space. And then I'm also an introvert. And so in spite of being in leadership roles, silence and alone time is another personal act of self-care where I'm like, take the kids. And my husband, who happens to be principal, he takes the kids on, and because he has we're two administrator households, so that's its own thing. But some peace and alone time.
I like that. I like that. I resonate with that for sure. So we want to be mindful of your time, and we'll wrap up our conversation by, asking this question that we ask all of our guests is, tell us the song that gets you up the hill. Like, what is that? I don't know, that one song, or maybe just like an album that you put on that just kind of gets you up that hill or through the day.
Great question. The album in general right now, because I have different albums, but it's like the Renaissance album is like amazing. It just
Hmm.
takes me there. I'm just like, yeah, it just
Hmm.
but the song that got me up the hill when I saw the question is like Beyonce's Flawless. Um, because just like,
Yeah.
usually for me personally, if I'm like climbing hills because I'm having the challenge,
Hmm.
it's that song just kind of reminds me of, you know, things are okay. You're good. Keep
I
pushing.
love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Alex. This was such a great
Thank you,
conversation. We
Alex.
appreciate you and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was nice to be here and send me your addresses. I'll send you the book.
Oh, we
Okay.
fans too.